The name of this trash can is ideology.
Hey guys, what's up? Today we're going to be talking about taxation. Specifically, we're going to be addressing the phrase that you hear commonly in the United States political lexicon of
taxation is theft.
And that is, of course, from Ron Paul, but this is a very common phrase that you'll hear from, if you have libertarian friends or people that tend to be more on the libertarian side of right-wing politics, particularly in the United States. You'll hear them utter this fairly regularly. I think everyone has heard it at some point. So I want to kind of look at that and figure out why it isn't, right? I'm going to talk about the 3 reasons that I see that it's not theft, but I'm not throwing this baby out the bathwater. I do think that they have a point when they say this, and I think that it opens up a deeper philosophical discussion that is very interesting for us to look at when we're trying to understand economics from a better more holistic perspective. So let's go through. The first is legality. Now, basically, this is what I would call this kind of a cop-out, but it is technically the case. And that's that taxation isn't theft because theft is a criminal term and taxation is a legal distinction, right? So when we're talking about theft, we have to understand that if it's not the crime of theft, that's not really an accurate term, right? And this is also comes across as kind of a version of begging the question, because when people are saying this, they're trying to say that taxes aren't justified, right? And the disagreement that we're having when we're talking about is taxation theft, is it not, is who has the right to tax money? To the tax revenue, rather. You or the government, right? And calling it theft is kind of avoiding the argument. And it's assuming that the answer is that it's your property to begin with. So you're assuming the answer in the premise, right? This is not a good way to argue, and it's pretty sloppy. So that's why this is a pretty common initial refutation of the claim of taxation being theft. And I highly suggest checking out some of Ben Burgess's commentary on this for a more fleshed out version. He does a really good job, and he also addresses this in a book that I'll be reviewing called Give Them an Argument. Let's say, okay, that's a little bit of a cop-out. I agree. We're kind of just being a stickler for definitions, and I don't like that as a good argument when we're trying to get to the base of it, because I want to know what the root problem is. So then reason number 2 is that we need to then prove rightful ownership, right? If we want to establish that something is theft, we need to have 2 things. We need to have a rightful owner, and then we need to have that property that is owned dispossessed from that rightful owner. Those are the 2 things that constitute theft. So for taxation to be theft, let's agree that the government in the US collects taxes in the form of US dollars, right? So then we need to understand, okay, what are US dollars, right? So dollars are functionally just slips of paper that the US government issues out as functionally IOUs. And essentially the responsibility of the Treasury then is to back these dollars, right? So the US government, we have confidence in the US as a lender to be able to back that money. And then that's how we value it, right? Because people know the US is going to be good for what is spent. This is very different than what it used to be whenever we had money backed by the gold standard. Then you maybe had a little bit more of an argument here because you're talking about possibly taking someone's actual physical money. But in this case, it's a slip of paper that's printed and circulated by the government, right? So this, again, we've kind of struck out, right? Because money is the government's property to print and tax. And like the classic example of this is, technically speaking, if you own firewood, right, or paper, you can burn that. It's illegal to burn US money. The reason? Because it's not your property. You aren't able to destroy it because you're destroying the government's property. So again, we're on strike 2, okay? But now I want to get to the deeper philosophical discussion, okay? So my 3rd reason that I don't think that taxation is theft is, let's have a discussion of where does property come from? It isn't the crime of theft. Okay, we've already gotten through that. And then dollars are technically the government's property. But there is the caveat that some people will make where they'll say that the dollar represents their labor value and therefore it is stealing, right? Because it's stealing the labor value that that person created. And it's also stealing the ability to transact that money for other property, in essence, stealing their property. And this is an interesting philosophical discussion to have, because now we need to understand, okay, well, where does the property come from though? Because as an example, say you own land in the US. How do you own that land? And what I mean by this more specifically is when we look historically, what was required for you to own it, right? None of this stuff happens in a vacuum. No material resources exist in a vacuum, like absence of history and interconnected economies. So if we're being serious, we have to admit that at one point, the land that you own was used and lived on by Native Americans, right? And that land was taken away by settlers that came to America. And, this is also true in Europe through the enclosure of commons, specifically the enclosure of common lands prior to the Industrial Revolution. This started in England, but it's the classic shift from feudalism to capitalism, as common lands that were lived off of for centuries beforehand were enclosed by then now landowners that owned those private lands that they then would allow those former serfs to come and work on as employees and sell their labor. So either way, there was at one point land, this property, that was owned by the commons, right? And then it was taken privately to have value extracted from it. And through the years, the land in both of these scenarios has been defended by the military until it became yours, right? We don't take land with us when we die. Whatever I do on my land is going to affect the future generation. It is even going to affect the present generation in examples of environmental waste and things like that. So that is kind of a important detail to understand. When we're talking about private property can't exist without some structure to defend the rightful ownership of this property. In this case, we're talking about the military. So if we really want to talk about rightful ownership, how is it that your ownership today is rightful, but Native American ownership in the United States and feudal communal ownership of land in Europe, why is it that that property, that right to property, was completely ignored, right? So the answer is that it isn't rightful ownership, right? Because the reality is that anytime someone is owning privatized land or property, at some point in time, that was taken away from the commons. And that's something important to understand, because when libertarians make this argument, they're acting as though history doesn't matter. They're acting as though who owns it currently is the rightful owner and there's no questions asked about it. That's not how the real world works. And this brings up the bigger point of why there isn't such a thing as a natural right to property as people like John Locke proposed back in the Enlightenment, because it just stands up because of the facade of ownership through exploitation of power, right? Like, as an example, back to the Native Americans, why is it that you own land today and the Native Americans right, and that right to property should be upheld, but the right to, their right to property should not be upheld? The only difference is that the US has a power imbalance to keep your property yours and to defend your property against people that want to commit arson or steal it or whatnot. And they use that same power against the Native Americans to expropriate that land and give it out for private ownership. That's why there isn't a consistent defense of ownership of property. The only way you can get there is by ignoring the violation of the same property rights of a previous person or people. And so that's the thing, is the irony is that if you follow this generally, right-wing libertarian cry to its logical conclusion, you actually end up realizing that private property is a theft of resources that were accessible to the public by whomever has the biggest guns and the most economic power at that time. So ironically, taxation is not theft, but property is.